Luke 9, starting in the beginning of chapter, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, "Take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic." They are to rely completely on God's provision for their needs as they go. "Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave their town as a testimony against them." So they set out and went from village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. Now in Matthew chapter 10, gives a lot more information here about the sorts of instructions that Jesus told them. But the idea here is that they were to go out and take nothing but what they had and trust on God's provision for them as they went from town to town, setting the stage for Jesus' upcoming ministry. I think that's one thing they're doing, and he'll do this again later with a wider group of apostles, 72 of them instead of just 12. And I think they are setting the stage for Jesus' upcoming ministry, going to the places where he's planning on going, and kind of preparing the way for him, like John the Baptist did initially. And also, I believe, getting experience for what they're going to be doing when the church is formed, and after Jesus' ministry is over and the church is formed, as they go out and preach the gospel all around the world. I think they're getting practice for that too. They don't know that, but I think that's something else that's going on at this time. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was going on, and he was perplexed, because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead. Yes, Timber? Is that what you think? You think John was raised from the dead here? No? Others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. So there were various reports and theories about what was going on. But Herod said, "I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about?" And he tried to see him. Now the other Gospels have Herod questioning. This Gospel makes it clear that after, I guess, being confused initially, Herod dismissed the idea this was John reincarnated or resurrected. But he isn't sure what he is. He's not John the Baptist, and apparently Herod thought for a while he might have been. But he's not sure what he is at this point. When the apostles returned, and I don't know how long they were doing this, a month, 2 months, 3 months, probably not very long. Jesus' entire ministry lasted about 3 years, we think. So my guess is, and Israel is not very big. Okay, it's not. Living in the United States today, it sometimes can kind of create a distortion in my mind. I think a lot of people's mind about these sorts of things, because Israel is a very small territory physically. Even living in Illinois, it's like Israel isn't even close to the size of Illinois, let alone the United States. This is the other cat, or another cat. This is another cat, the sister of Timber. Very similar to Timber in some ways, and very different in others. But Israel is about the size of Rhode Island. It's not very big, and so 6 groups of now in Matthew, Luke didn't necessarily say it here, but Matthew says that he sent them out 2 by 2. So 6 pairs of preachers can cover Israel pretty quickly. It wouldn't. And later on, when there's 72 of them, like they could cover this territory fairly quickly. So I don't know how long it took. I'm assuming a couple of months, but I don't know. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them. He's trying to retire with them. After they've had this kind of test run of their ministry, he's trying to retreat with them somewhere. Basically go on a retreat. We would call today like a ministry retreat. and just be with them alone for a while. But the crowds heard about it and followed him. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here." Now, as we'll read in John, there was more to this conversation than just this, but this is the essence of it. He replied, "You give them something to eat." They answered, "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd." About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." The disciples did so, and everybody sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, presumably 1 basket for each disciple. Now, John will go into much more detail about this. All this incident is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And John will go into the most detail of this incident by far. There was a lot more to this than what Matthew, Mark, or Luke report. And there was a lot more to the aftermath of this, too. This event was a very significant event. And we know this only by the fact that all 4 Gospels record it, but John will actually go into much more detail about why this was such a significant event. John will also date this as being around the Passover, and presumably about a year before Jesus' final Passover and the end of his ministry. So we know this event probably occurred with a year left to go in Jesus' ministry. But we'll get to that when we get to the Gospel of John. Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, so he does have some time alone with them. After the incident with the feeding of the 5,000, he did manage to get some time alone with his apostles. "Who do the crowd say I am?" Now, in the other Gospels, he's referring to who do the crowd say the Son of Man is. So he's referring to himself as the Son of Man. Here he's just saying I. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." That's the same thing that Herod heard. So these must have been the common theories that were going around at the time. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "The Messiah of God, the Anointed One of God." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, "Not yet, because this is going to raise opposition and get everyone into conflict. The Anointed One is a king, but Israel already has rulers who don't particularly want to make way for another ruler. It already has Herod. We mentioned him just a moment ago. It has Pontius Pilate, the governor overseeing the territory on behalf of Rome. It has Caesar lurking in the background. It has the Sanhedrin, the judicial court of Israel. It has the high priest, the religious authority. These people, now the Pharisees might be in favor of a Messiah, but they don't really like this guy. They don't want him to be the Messiah. Of course, they're also not really a political group with no real authority. So going around proclaiming that he's the Messiah, which he will eventually do. He is going to do that in a year. Okay, he is going to do that eventually. But going around doing that will cause conflict, and it does cause conflict. It eventually causes them to kill him. And as of now, it's still not time for that. That's still a year away yet. Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life." And we know, of course, in the other accounts that Peter objected to this, and so Jesus had to rebuke Peter. Then he said to them all, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." That's our indication of how he's going to die, taking up the cross. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me will save it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be killed to be saved in the name of Jesus. Okay? Taking up the cross daily. I mean, he took up the cross literally, physically, one time on his way to the crucifixion. So we're not talking about like taking up the cross once and then being put to death and that's it. Taking up the cross daily means putting aside your own desires and wants and even needs and putting them on the shelf and putting God's mission ahead of that. Dying to yourself, as Paul will talk about frequently. The idea of taking up your cross refers to dying to yourself. Jesus took up the cross physically one time on his way to the crucifixion. But that doesn't mean that we only do this once and die and that's it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit his very soul? Or self, in this case. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. I tell you the truth. Some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. Now that actually refers to multiple different things. The very next thing is going to be the account of the Transfiguration, which I think is a partial fulfillment of that statement. But also the kingdom was launched when Jesus went up to heaven, and then the Spirit came on them on the day of Pentecost, and they preached to the crowd. And they all saw that, except for Judas, I guess. So they are going to see the launch of the kingdom on earth in about a year or so. In addition to what's going to happen here. Now that's not the full fulfillment of final kingdom. Okay, Hebrews goes into detail about the different parts of the kingdom, of which the church on earth is one part. There are other aspects to the kingdom that are out there, and the whole kingdom will come together and be one thing someday. And part of that will be a renewed physical creation, a renewed glory of the physical creation, which we see previewed here in the Transfiguration. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James, so again John's name goes first, with him and went up to him onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, so Jesus wasn't the only one shining. Moses and Elijah were too. So not as brightly, I'm sure, but they were not in tattered rags or in humble clothes like they would have been in their lives, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, or his exodus, his upcoming exodus from this world, hinting back, of course, to the Exodus narrative and the ministry of Moses and Elijah, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. So this must have been at night when this happened. I don't know why they'd be very sleepy during the day unless they had traveled up this mountain and they were tired and wanted to take some afternoon naps. So it seems like this happened at night. As the men were leaving Jesus, now this is a detail that wasn't in Matthew or Mark. Apparently they were doing something, either fading away or floating back up into heaven or something, or maybe they had literally turned around and were walking away, I'm not sure. Somehow or another, it was clear that they were leaving. Moses and Elijah were leaving. Now the other Gospels, Matthew and Mark, didn't mention that detail, but Luke does. Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. So he didn't want them to go. He thought, he recognized them clearly. He had never seen Moses. Moses lived 1,500 years before Peter did. He had never seen Elijah. Elijah lived 800 years before Peter did. He would have had no idea what those men would have looked like. But somehow or another, when they appeared in the mountain with Jesus, Peter, James, and John all recognized them, which is a hint that we're going to recognize those who are in the kingdom to come, even if we never saw them on earth. And somehow or another, he knew they were leaving. They were there for a while. They were talking with Jesus about his imminent departure and how that was going to fulfill the law and the prophets. Moses and Elijah stand for the law and the prophets. And I believe it was really them. I mean, I don't believe it was symbolic or that it was somehow a symbolic or hallucination fulfillment. But they are there. They are there. It is purposely these two guys because of what they stand for. I believe it was these two guys. But I believe they also are there. It was specifically these two guys because of what they stood for. Moses having given the law. And Elijah was not by any means the only prophet. Moses was a prophet. But he did, somehow or another, he did come to kind of represent the prophets. So, and the prophets spoke of Jesus, which Jesus himself says in the scriptures many times. And the law pointed to Jesus. So they're there to talk to him about his fulfillment of the law and the prophets, which Jesus himself said he was going to do back in the Sermon on the Mount. And somehow or another, they gave the impression that they were about to leave. And Peter apparently didn't want them to leave. Now again, Matthew and Mark don't record that detail. They do say that Peter was frightened. Maybe he was frightened because he didn't want them to leave. Maybe he was just frightened in general because of the weird thing that was going on. I'm not sure. But he wanted them to stay. So he wanted to build tents or temporary huts for them to give them a place to stay and hang out for a while. He didn't want them to leave. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Let's go back to the Exodus when they were led out of Egypt and through the wilderness by a cloud. And also when a cloud settled on the tabernacle at the end of Exodus, when a cloud settled on the tabernacle, and even when they settled on the temple, when they dedicated the temple in the days of Solomon. And we just read in Psalm 104 how God rides in the clouds, and we saw in Ezekiel how he has a chariot that rides on the clouds. Jesus will leave earth on a cloud. And they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. So Moses and Elijah, I guess, disappeared in the cloud. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. Obviously, they told people later, because here it is. Okay, Luke wasn't there for this. Matthew wasn't there for this, and it's in his gospel too. Mark wasn't there for this. Okay, he got that from somewhere. Okay, so they told this to somebody at some point. 1 John and 2 Peter will both reference this event in some way or another. So they did tell people this later, but they didn't tell anybody at this point in time. They probably didn't know what it meant themselves, actually. As we read about in the other Gospels. They had to ask Jesus what this all meant. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him, and it is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." These, of course, would be the 9 guys who did not go up with Jesus to the mountaintop. "Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the evil spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, "Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men." But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. They didn't really want to know. Part of the reason why it was hidden from them is because they really didn't want to know. And we'll go back to that statement in the previous chapter about seeing but not perceiving, hearing but not understanding. They really didn't want to know. None of these 12 guys signed up for a Messiah, to serve a Messiah whose destiny, whose appointed his ministry was to actually die at the hands of his enemies. They all thought, all 12 of these guys, thought they were signing up for a Messiah who would conquer his enemies, and then they would get to share in his kingdom. And we know this partially because of what happens next. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. And he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you all, he is the greatest." And we read about this in the other Gospels, and we'll read about it this later on in this Gospel and in John's Gospel. But these men weren't thinking of that this time. These men were thinking about positioning themselves. It'd be basically like politicians today elbowing themselves aside to get positions in the upcoming administration when a president comes into office. We actually kind of see this right now. It's July 1st. The election is in several months. The new administration won't take over until next January. It's like, we pretty much know the current guy is toast. Okay? After last week, pretty much everyone in America knows that the current guy is toast. He's done. He's not going to win. He may not even serve out the rest of his term. So now it's all about elbowing each other for a position to be in a good position for the next administration. Whether you're a Republican and you want to get on Trump's good graces to be part of his administration, or you're a Democrat and you're thinking ahead to 2028 because you consider this next one to be a wash. Like that, we've been seeing this play out now constantly in front of our eyes for the last 3 days. It happens all the time. And that's what these guys were doing. And we read about in the previous Gospels that James and John even sent their mother to ask Jesus for them to have elevated positions as Jesus' right and left hand. So that's what they were thinking of. They were thinking of a king who was going to come in, mop up his enemies, claim his throne, and then these 12 guys would be his administrators ruling the world on his behalf. And that is ultimately what happened. It was just not in the way they were thinking of it at the time. So that's part of the reason why it was hidden from them. They just didn't want, they had a different purpose in mind for where Jesus' ministry was going to go than what he did. Now, not everyone did. You know, there will be a woman, Mary of Bethany, who will come up and anoint Jesus for his burial. Okay, so some people, not these 12 guys, but some people did see through it, or at least more clearly than these guys did. I'm not sure necessarily if Mary Magdalene, which I think is Mary of Bethany, that was at their tomb to anoint his body after death and did not expect him to be raised. So even there, even someone who saw more clearly what Jesus' ministry was actually about still did not expect the resurrection. But these guys had very different mindsets in store for what they wanted Jesus to be and what they wanted him to do than what he was actually going to do. "Master," said John, "we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us. He doesn't have the right to do that. He is not in the favored circle, the inner group. We didn't give him the authority to." They got the authority to do that from Jesus in the previous chapter, or at the beginning of this chapter. This guy didn't. What's he doing this for? "Do not stop him," Jesus said. "Forever is not against you, it's for you." So he can't be against you if he's speaking and acting in Jesus' name, and things are happening. I think that's enough for today. That's the end of this part of Luke's Gospel. The next verse says, "As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem." So in the next verse, we're going to begin what we call the road trip portion of Luke, where Jesus is basically traveling to Jerusalem. Now, this is not all one straightforward trip, and all these things that Luke records in the next 10 chapters did not happen during this one long road trip. This is basically where Luke is going to put stuff that he doesn't know where to put elsewhere, where else to put some of this stuff. And so we're going to be going all over the place when covering this road trip. We're going to be kind of putting all kinds of stuff in the category of this road trip to Jerusalem, which is going to end with Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. But we know that not all this stuff could have happened along the way, because Jesus is going to be going all over the place. Things are going to be happening out of sequence. So, but everything is being, and Jesus made more than one trip to Jerusalem during his ministry. We know that from John. So Luke is not arranging this stuff chronologically. But we are going to begin the next section of Luke. Probably like the part of Luke that Luke is most interested in is this road trip to Jerusalem. He covered the beginning of Jesus' ministry pretty quickly. The first 4 chapters are all about like his origin or like his beginning. And the next 5 chapters, 4, 5 through 9, we're like setting the table for his ministry. And that material covers a lot of Matthew and Mark, but Luke is most interested in presenting this kind of road trip series of adventures. But of course, not all of it would have actually happened on a singular trip to Rome at the end of his ministry. This would have been all these things that are going to be recorded here. A lot of them would have happened at different times and contexts, and Luke is just kind of putting them all here for narrative purposes. But we'll get to that next time.